Welcome to Read Between the Lines, a book podcast. I am your host, Molly Southgate, and today I'm interviewing
Ashley Winstead.
Hey there, how are you today?
I'm so good. How are you doing?
I am doing great. So, can you tell me about your book?
Yes. Okay. So I have my debut novel coming out on August 3rd, and it's called In My Dreams, I Hold a Knife. And it's an adult thriller with a dark academic setting. And it's about a woman named Jessica Miller who's going back to her 10-year college reunion. And in the beginning of the story, what you know about her and what she's self-reporting is that she's just become obsessed with the idea of going back to her reunion. She tells you it's because she's changed so much since she was a college student, since she was this person who was constantly the runner-up, constantly second place, never the winner. Someone who just felt always overlooked and mediocre in her friend group. And she wants to go to this reunion because she wants the chance to make good and show everyone this extremely accomplished person that she's become. So that's what she tells you. And of course, the real reasons are far deeper, far more complex, and you uncover them throughout the book. But essentially, the story follows her from New York, where she lives, to her college in North Carolina, where she meets up with her old college friends. And back in the day, she and her group were really popular. They, had pulled pranks and had antics and were very notorious on campus. Mm-hmm. And they used to be called the East House 7. And that's after the dorm that they all met in their freshman year. So the East House 7 reunited, except now, 10 years later, there's only 5 of them left. One of them, Heather Shelby, was very brutally murdered their senior year of college in an unsolved case, a case that remains unsolved to this day. And another, the second, Jack Carroll, was accused of killing her, but never convicted. And he, of course, is now a total social pariah, and no one talks to him. So you're here with Jessica at her reunion. And of course, all of her fantasies, as you can probably guess, about how homecoming is going to go and all this glory she's going to have go quickly sideways, especially when it turns out that someone else was just as obsessed with the reunion as she was, but for a completely different reason. Mm-hmm. Because they want to use the opportunity where everyone has come back to campus to flush out and trap Heather's real killer. So that's essentially the book. That's the premise. There's lots of drama, lots of secrets and twists. And it's told in alternating past and present timelines, and mostly from Jessica's point of view.
And this book is just so incredible. I recently finished it, and I've been recommending it to all of my friends, and I just want to immerse myself in this world even more. It is such an excellent read. And
thank you so much.
Of course. And I still cannot believe it's a debut novel. And I've read a lot of debut novels, and I've read amazing ones. And this one, I'm still in shock.
Oh my gosh. If you could see me right now, you'd see bright red cheeks because I'm just blushing so hard. Thank you so much.
I'm so glad. Well, it's the truth. It really is amazing.
Thank you.
So this has a really interesting setting, as you were saying. It's got this really cool dark academia setting. Could you tell me a little bit more about how you decided to write in that sort of sphere?
Yeah. So I am personally kind of just obsessed with college as a setting. Really all schools, especially, boarding schools, colleges, because for a writer, they're just this really rich site. It's kind of like a locked room scenario just by itself. You've got everyone living in this space. You've got students from all over the country and the world. You've got faculty. You've got everyone living and, all this clashing ambition and desire. And of course, when you've got college students, you've also got debauchery and a lot of bad decisions happening. So it's just this really ripe setting as a writer. I also say just personally for me, college was this incredible place, almost like going to college for me, growing up working class, I was a first generation college student. And so my entire life in high school and even before then was all about getting to college. It was like this magical place where if I went there the rest of my life, so I understood, I would make the friends that I'd have for the rest of my life. I'd be able to get a great job. It would be my ticket essentially. And so it had a lot of weight, and I can still remember the feeling when I was a freshman, and I went to college in Nashville, Tennessee, and my parents leaving after helping me move in, walking around this campus. And I was very fortunate to go to a really beautiful campus, just like lots of trees and National Arboretum, and walking around this campus and looking at the buildings and thinking to myself, this is the start of the rest of my life. Like anything is possible. I have made it. And of course, like that's just too good to be true. Like there's no place in the world that's like that. But I think that's such a shared experience for so many people, that college is that rich, right place where you're going to become yourself. And so I think that, that's also, a lot of people are nostalgic for college, and you also in college, like run up against the truth and like your dreams and your ambitions hitting that hard wall of reality. So it just becomes, I think, just a really rich place to explore and return back to.
What you were just saying too, that's so interesting that you got there and like you automatically felt like this freedom. And in the book, Jessica talks about never quite feeling that freedom. Yes. And it's just an interesting thing that you're writing almost from the opposite perspective.
Yeah, I love that point. And I think that probably has to do because I'm now however many years out from college reflecting back on it. And I think it's that I can still feel the feeling of freedom. Like it's almost like it was just yesterday of walking around that campus, but I also have this perspective looking back and seeing all the ways that what I thought was going to happen didn't happen. And I guess Jessica is kind of like, a character who represents that really full spectrum of how it can be, the possibility and the disappointment of those dreams. So I also will say that I started writing In My Dreams I Hold a Knife in like February 2019. And it was a few months after I went to my own 10-year college reunion. And clearly I need some time months to process my experience. But when I went back, I was so hyped, so excited to go back to campus. Your 5 and your 10 year always, they make a big deal out of it. And so many of my former I almost said colleagues, classmates were going back. And so I just thought like it would almost be like plugging back into what it felt like 10 years ago. And I got there and it was so underwhelming. It was so disappointing. Nothing felt the way that it did back then. People were married, they had families, they weren't as concerned with the football game or any of the things that we were concerned about when we were, 22 to 18 to 22. And of course, like, that's so reasonable. And I don't know why I was expecting to like just be able to walk back into that old life, but it really hit me. And I, at one point during the weekend, kind of broke away from my friends and everyone else and just walked across campus on my own and looked at all of the buildings that I had made such an impression on me when I was 18 and there for the first time. And they hadn't changed. They were all the same. They were just as beautiful. Mm-hmm. And I really had this almost like mourning experience for the girl that I had been and everything she wanted and knowing, fast forward 10 years, like a lot of great things did happen, but a lot of things that she wanted didn't. Mm-hmm. And I just had this experience of kind of like honoring her and seeing myself for who I'd been back then, and really just like letting it go in a way.
I really love like hearing about that, and especially like within the context of the book, and like hearing about how you were able to find that peace, because the character, without spoiling anything, it's a wildly different experience, and she almost learns wildly different experience. But but like also emotionally, like she learns that she hasn't really changed, and a lot of the characters are stunted because of what happened in their senior year.
That's the perfect word. They are, and it's so funny. Like you saying that makes me. You're absolutely right, because they almost were frozen into who they were when they were in college. Because for them, in some ways, especially for Jessica, like she kind of can go back, because she's never really had the development that you would expect a person to have. And first of all, that's just like, the beauty of fiction. You get to explore these other paths, but also that just immediately begs the question, like, why is she frozen in time? Like what made things freeze for her? And for her, it's a lot of trauma. And so I won't go to, won't spoil anything, but that's kind of at the heart for all of them. But especially for her, as to why things have like frozen in amber in some ways.
Oh yeah, very much so. And actually I kind of want to hone in on what you were just saying, how she's kind of frozen because of that trauma, because the way that you write her trauma, and honestly all of the characters' trauma like that, I found really interesting and very engaging. And like the way that you describe, once again, without spoiling anything, that she feels like she almost has this blackness inside of her brain, like this pool. I just thought that was a really, really fascinating allegory, and it can feel very real, and I just thought that was something that I really enjoyed about the book, for sure.
Thank you. With that, it was like this, another, I feel like I'm going to paint myself as, a certain kind of person. So I hope, I hope not, but, there's something that is very fascinating to me too, that's really tied to college, which is when a lot of people go to college, they drink a lot, right? Mm-hmm. Or they engage in using other substances, and, blackouts or brownouts are really common experiences. It's kind of like woven into a lot of college life. And so that's something that I'm playing with Jessica. And something that has always fascinated me is who you are in the moments when you're not like consciously aware of yourself, or your filters turned off. And something I've wondered a lot is like, are you your truest self in those moments? Or are you, some sort of funhouse mirror horror version of yourself? And like, how do you take ownership over that? And I think a lot of those same questions can apply to who you are, maybe after experiencing trauma. Yeah. And a lot of similar impulses to kind of just push these things down, like push these things that have happened to you down, whether it's something that's happened to you or you've done, or, there's a desire to kind of like cut it away so you don't have to own it as part of your identity. And so I was really trying to kind of like marry those things in Jessica. And that's, of course, like so many of the things that haunt her are things that she's done herself. And how does she grapple with that?
Yeah, very much so. And there are parts in the book where she really goes into what you describe as like the blackness, like this pool. And And so many of those times when she was remembering, I was horrified by what she was doing, but I also felt such a sense of sympathy, and like I just really wanted like to protect her, because the way that you were writing it with such like an almost, this is going to sound very weird, like a loving hand, like you were making it seem like it was coming from you, because it's in a mostly like, it's told from Jessica's perspective. And I just thought that was a very interesting exercise in empathy while reading the book.
That is so amazing. And I appreciate that so much. I think that is honestly the highest compliment you can pay a writer. So I'm just sitting here in gratitude. And I'm really glad that that came across, because I think if there's one way to summarize like all of what I'm trying to do when I write, is to portray things that might seem unfathomable or on first glance horrifying, or something that you can't picture or relate to, with so much empathy that I can create a bridge so that readers can kind of understand why someone might do that. I just feel like fiction is like an empathy making enterprise at its very core. That's why I do it.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Yeah. Can you elaborate on that a little bit? What you were just saying about fiction and empathy?
Yeah. So it's kind of funny because I write across genres. I write both right now, at least for now, though I have plans to write in even more genres, but I write thrillers and romantic comedies. And all of my characters are, I will call them flawed, to be kind. Some of them are much more flawed than others, but none of them are people. Yeah. None of them are people that you would look at and be like, oh yeah, easy, good person, like no question. All of them you look at and you're like, oh, there's a lot of stuff going on with this person. And wow. And so I'm so drawn to telling stories about complicated, flawed people that compel empathy. And, you know, I'm going to play armchair therapist for myself right now, but I'm sure that comes from a place of like understanding myself as a flawed, complicated person, and really wanting to know that, you know, despite all of that, you know, there's empathy for me, you know, and understanding for me, and, you know, for everyone else we love that we also understand are flawed and complicated people. So that's really what motivates me as a writer. And especially when it comes to writing women, like women, all my stories revolve around women who make really questionable choices, who want things that maybe society shouldn't tell them they want, that, you know, society wouldn't want them to want, or they're wanting the things, probably in Jessica's case, that society is telling them you absolutely should want this, but she's wanting it and wanting to get there in a way that society would say, oh, no, you can't be that ambitious. We can't be that cutthroat. That's not for you. So I'm just so motivated in my writing to explore those complicated choices and do it in a way that a reader says, you know what, I would have gone into this maybe hating this person, but I can see why. I can see why they would do it. Totally. That to me is like the power of storytelling. It's creating those bridges between people.
Oh, so much so. Like I'm 100% agreeing with what you're saying on this, because like for me too, a lot of the shows I watch, the books I read, all of that the media that I consume, it's usually about deeply flawed people, and I enjoy it because it's a way of understanding other ways of thought. And I'm firmly in the camp that people should be reading, especially to understand different types of people from yourself. And that can mean anything, and that includes books like this, where the characters probably making decisions that you would never make, but it's still seeing how they do that.
Yep. And saying like, you know what, I can understand why you would make that choice in that scenario, given where you've come from.
Yes.
And it's actually really funny because, I've one of my readers group questions that my publisher sent to me. It was so fun to write answers to these questions that hopefully future readers groups will look at. Was, what advice do you have for girls in college or like Jessica, or just really anyone who's kind of grappling with some of the things that Jessica is grappling with, like deep insecurity, trauma. And I realized I thought a lot about this because that felt like a question that my answer, there was an enormous responsibility I felt in answering that question well. And I realized that there's something that I've started to say to myself and to my sister and to other people I'm really close to in my life when they're really fraught and being self-critical. But I will say, treat yourself, understand yourself like you would, and invest in knowing yourself and where you came from and what your story is, the way you would a complex character in a story. We extend so much empathy to anti-heroes or just characters in books and TV shows and movies. And we're willing to do the empathetic exercise of saying, I see where you came from, and now I understand your choices. And it's so much harder to do that for yourself, because you want to hold yourself to such high standards, or you get so quickly disappointed with yourself. And being able to extend that same empathy and at least like allowance for context, even if you looking at all of that, saying like, I know where I came from. I know I didn't make the right decision in this moment, but I understand why I made it. Like the burden, I don't know, it's changed my life to kind of look at it that way. And so that was where I went in the answer to that question.
That really is so amazing. As soon as this interview is done, I'm going to write that down to save for myself, because I've struggled with insecurities before, and I know everyone does. And it's so important to remember things like that.
Yeah, you got to extend that same care to yourself that you give even a fictional character.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. Like that really is amazing. So kind of on a pivot, can you tell me how you started writing?
Started writing just in general?
Just in general, like how you got into it.
My mind immediately flashed back to like 7-year-old Ashley. I know. Like most writers, I have been just fascinated by language my entire life and storytelling. I know storytelling is kind of like the magic thing that every human being shares, that we all gravitate to. But as a kid, I just loved the musicality of language, and I loved putting sentences together. And so I have this really vivid memory of getting some homework assignment where we had to, invent a short story, and it had to involve like the ocean or, something like that.
Yeah.
I think it was the ocean because I grew up a Navy brat. My dad was in the Navy. So we moved every 2 years, but it was always to some different coastal town. The ocean was always a big part of my life. So I think it was that. And I remember taking this assignment so seriously and walking around my room, finger to my lip, considering, and just going, like saying the same sentence over and over again and trying to really feel the words, like the how different words fit in terms of how it sounded. And I didn't know it at the time, but like the different valences and all the different contingent meanings that are attached to different words. So and I just felt very fulfilled in that very early moment. But then, I knew from that point that I wanted to be a writer. I pursued writing. I was in English and creative writing and art history, but really focused on creative writing and English major in college. And that was just no questions about it. I was going to be a writer. And then my senior year of college, I got into a really bad car accident right before I was going to apply. The plan was I was going to apply to MFA programs around the country. And so I had teed up everything, gotten everything ready. But I had a few really key application materials left that I need to work on. And then I got into a really terrible car accident. And I actually had to drop out of school for a little while to focus on physical therapy. And I was concerned, I'd never use my right hand again, and everything is fine. And I did, and I'm totally fine. Mm-hmm. But it happened right when I had applications due. So long story short, I filled out those applications probably terribly. And I got rejected from every single MFA program that I applied to. And that could have been the case if I hadn't had gotten to, a car accident whatsoever, but I will never know. And that's always frustrating to look back and have this unsolved mystery. But essentially, I took that as the world telling me that I just wasn't a good enough writer, that this was just not the thing for me. I'd grown up, kind of inflating my own ego and sense that I was a good writer, but this was cold, hard facts that I just wasn't. And so I didn't write for 10 years after that. I lost a whole decade. I know. I hate it. I did other great things. I got a lot of life in, and that's all well and good. I got my PhD and went and worked out in the entertainment industry. So cool, fun things. But 10 years I lost.
And you're such a brilliant writer too. Hearing this, it's really, really sad. I'm sorry you had to get into that accident and everything. But
I appreciate that.
It's so hard to hear that you lost 10 years of this. But the important thing is that you are doing it now,
Yes. And what I really regret more than anything is just that I just took those rejections as the word, as case closed. When every writer has heard the be persistent, never give up advice. And it's the most important advice for a reason, because oftentimes when you get rejected, it has nothing to do with the writer you are, the quality of your work, or the writer that you can become if you just keep at it. So I'm just disappointed in myself for giving up that easily back then. But fast forward 10 years later, and I had finished my PhD. I'd written what was essentially a book-length dissertation, and I'd gotten really good at the daily grind of writing, waking up, sitting in front of my screen for 8 to 10 hours, and working on the same thing, which you got to have that grit and that diligence if you're going to write books. And so I did this, and I thought, okay, I could do that for, no shade to academia, but for something that was pretty dry, that I enjoyed, but wasn't anywhere near the level of passion I have for stories. I bet I could do it for a book. And I had to tell myself that I was going to write a book for absolutely no one except myself, and that maybe I wouldn't even show it to anyone. And that was the lowering of the stakes, because I still had all that fear from 10 years ago and being told that my writing wasn't good enough. So I had to convince myself and tell myself, this will just be a side project. You'll do this instead of watching Netflix because it'll be fun, And so that is how I got back into book writing.
That really, really is amazing. And I had an interview yesterday, and we were kind of talking along the lines of what you were just saying too, where that industry, and I've never tried to publish something, but I'm an actress, so I get it. these industries, they are so hard. They're so grueling to
Oh
try
my gosh.
and get everything and like accept that sort of rejection. So I fully understand when you were saying that. And I know it's a really, really common thing. A lot of people get deterred from this because of those rejections. And I think it's really incredible that you kept pushing forward and pursuing this.
Thank you. And like, yes, you have to be Teflon, don't you? Like you really, it's when people say it's not the most talented people necessarily that end up making it, but simply the most dogged.
Yeah.
I think that's really true. And I'm determined to, if nothing else, just be persistent because that's the thing that's in my control.
Yeah. In so many creative industries, it's this way too, where it's like you just said, you just have to be persistent and it will work in the end. But yeah. So can you share any tips about writing in general or more specifically, writing a thriller?
Ooh, yeah. Okay. So obviously with the caveat that everyone is going to do it different and you got to find your thing that works for you, your method. I approach thriller writing, again, way too revealing and I'm, whatever, but as a confessional process. So, what I'm really interested, because it's so much about like looking at the really hard parts of human beings and like, and seeing that and having, empathy for it. So that's how I write thrillers. I have a totally different approach to romantic comedies and like other kinds of fiction. But the thing that really unlocks writing thrillers for me is to figure out like what it is that I want to confess about. And so I start in that's a really personal way to start. But then I move away from the personal in all of my character development. So it's almost like that's like the seed where I think like, okay, here's something that I want to confess about. And I do that because I'm betting that it's a universal experience. I'm betting that if something is fraught and really emotionally powerful and really hard for me, it's something a lot of people can relate to. So I'm almost like going personal to get at the universal. So I'll figure that out. And then I'm completely devoted to the craft book Story Genius. And I really would recommend this book and this approach to any writer, thriller or otherwise. And I apologize that I forget the author's name, but it's a totally genius approach to writing books that essentially argues the author, studied brain science, and argues that yes, plot is important. But a lot of writers get really caught up in creating nifty, flashy plots when at bottom, what readers are really reading books for is to make a connection with a character's brain and to see a character do things and go through experiences, and so that they can have that like almost indirect experience themselves. Like, so she goes into like mirror neurons and how your brain actually activates as you're reading, almost as if you were having that experience. Isn't that wild? I love that.
Mirror neurons especially. I've heard about those before. I've read stuff about them, and it's so fascinating. And especially like with reading, even in this book where I'm 14 years old. I've never been to college. I've never murdered anyone. But I still felt so much for the characters. And as I was reading it, like I really felt immersed in it. And I've had so many books like that where it's like nothing to do with it, but it touches on something. Also, the author is Lisa Cron.
Oh, thank you so much. I appreciate that.
Of course.
Lisa, you're a genius. If you're listening, you've helped me so much. So her approach to writing books you like after weighing all of that, is to really start with figuring out who your character is, who your main character is, and figuring out what that character's central misbelief is. Like misbelief about the world. It can really be anything. It can be really huge. It can be smaller depending on the kind of book you want to write. But she argues that if you really get down at the core of something your character has learned about the way life works, that is false, and it's that thing she's learned is going to be really tied to what she wants most in the world. And for a lot of people, of course, that's going to be love, companionship, maybe it's success. So there's something an interesting character has learned wrong about how to get what they want. And what an interesting book does, she argues, is confront that misbelief with that character and have them work through it, whether they come to a resolution or only get more, convinced of their misbelief. There's a lot of different interesting things you can do with that. But the reason I love that approach so much is you immediately get into so much depth with your characters. And so how I used it for In My Dreams, I Hold a Knife is I started with Jessica, the main character. And I really did a deep dive into who she is, what she wants, and what she has learned wrong about how the world works and how to get what she deeply, deeply wants. And so figuring that out for her, I was then able to, in turn, work on creating all of the other characters. So like the other 6 people who are part of the East House 7. And I did a similar deep dive process for each of them, but I knew that each of them needed to relate back to Jessica's, either her desires or her fears in some way. So like there's a character who is just blindingly perfect in her eyes in the way that she wishes that she could be. There's a character who rebels against the rules and establishment in a way that she would never do because to her it's too risky. There are all of these characters who are characters in their own right, but they all tie back to her. They pull at her strings, really. They press her buttons. And so I think that makes for compelling reading. Because
it certainly does.
Oh, thank you.
Like
configured that way. Yeah. So I did that for Jessica. And I also did that for Heather too, as I figured out okay, Heather was actually the last character that I did the deep dive into. And I thought, okay, knowing what I do about these other characters, how could Heather be what kind of a person could Heather be where it would touch in some way, all of these other characters' flaws or desires or things that they wanted. And so it took a lot of thinking and planning to kind of construct each of these characters. But once I did, I swear the plot flowed so easily. It just kind of flowed organically. And that's a promise that Lisa Cron makes in her book. She was like, if you figure out all of these things about your characters, and she has you do the background work of writing down scenes from their past in which they started to believe in their misbelief, where it's really solidified. She says, if you do all that work, I promise the plot is going to flow really organically out of, what you will know you need to do to really challenge these characters you've built. So that is an approach that I would recommend to anyone. That's how I approach writing. In My Dreams, I Hold a Knife. But I will also, if that sounds a little bit woo woo and, very emotion driven, I will add.
Really amazing.
Oh, good. Okay. I'm not sure.
I want everyone listening to this to write it down or keep it somewhere, because that is some of the best writing advice I've heard before. I remember well, we had to just let our audience know we had recorded this episode, but the recording, there was an issue. I forgot to record. But so we're re-recording it, and she had told me that before. And the first time that I heard it, I mean, you can attest to this, I was in complete shock. Like, it completely changed the way I thought about writing and reading 100%.
It's a game changer. Like, it did that for me too. Yeah. And I keep waiting for the magic to wear off. Like, I keep waiting for it not to work when I approach a new project, and it has not failed me. So I will, keep tuned to that. But so far it has just been like the richest way into writing books. And I will also add, though, that because when I read mysteries, I love when I see all the pieces. I love seeing the pieces fit together. That's why so many of us read the mysteries. It's because we want to see like the questions answered like clockwork. And so I was determined to write a book that kind of ticked just like that. And I made once I figured all my characters and like the general plot things that had to happen, I then made like almost a completely bananas 45-page outline of every single thing that was going to happen. And all the interlocking, like maybe I don't recommend this to writers because again, it was a little bananas, but all the interlocking plot points, I color coded them so I could look at it and see the like rainbow of different plot points twisting throughout the different chapters, and know that I hadn't left any plot holes and like all the questions had been answered. So that, it's both like an art and a science, I guess.
Yes. Yeah. See, I'm someone, by the terms, I don't know if you've heard this before, but I'm a pantser. I am not good at outlining.
You magical human.
Well, it's not great.
No, teach me your ways.
Oh, no, I want to learn how to outline. I did NaNoWriMo last November, and I was so determined to write an outline. And I sat down, and it was about 1 page, less than a page probably, actually, now that I think about it. And
I love it.
Yeah. So when you just said you wrote a 45-page one, I was like, my face like went white. And
you're like, why would you do that to yourself? But I'm betting, and then you can correct me, I'm betting you're like compelled. You're like, I know what the story is going to do, or you're going to figure out what the story is as you're writing it. And I love that. And I honestly feel like it's my own neuroticism and anxiety that I'm not going to be able to perform once I'm actually like writing on the blank page that compels me to essentially write the story first and then rewrite it. Because that's kind of what a 45-page outline is. It's like, I've written out the story.
Yeah, to a point. Yeah.
So I can see why people wouldn't want to do that.
I also very much have what you were just saying about the writing, where it's like, no, I won't perform once I'm writing it. Oh yeah, I also have that. I still just don't outline. It's not great. I would not recommend my style. I would recommend yours.
Yeah, we can start a podcast of like approaches people should not take, and I have plenty of those.
Yes, mine is the first one on the list. Yeah. Okay, well, this has really been so much fun. I'm so glad that I got to talk to you again today. Thank you for coming on.
Me too, Molly. You're the best. Thank you so much. I love talking to you.
I love talking to you too. All right. So I just have one last question, and that is, what do you have coming up?
Okay. So my next thriller, technically I have a rom-com coming up in spring 2022, but I am going to talk about my next thriller. And so it's coming out in August 2022, and it is essentially a sex cult revenge story, which I know sounds very campy, but I promise it's not campy. It's loosely based on the Sarah Lawrence sex cult story. And you probably haven't heard of that because, have you?
I know about it because I believe you told me about this one, or I heard it from somewhere.
That's right. Yep.
But for our audience, would you please explain?
Yes. I don't think a lot of people do know about it because even though it's a bonkers story, it was just featured in The Cut and a few other news outlets and then like weirdly went away. So essentially the story is that the father of a Sarah Lawrence student moved into her dorm with her and her suite mates, which is just weird in and of itself. But even weirder, over time, he essentially brainwashed her suite mates and then even more Sarah Lawrence students and indoctrinated them into essentially a cult. So he taught them all of his like teachings about the world, like especially how to be proper men and proper women. He dictated who they should have sex with, which is so creepy. He tortured them psychologically and physically. He extorted tons of money from their parents. So it's this really wild story of a true thing that happened. And I read this and I immediately thought, how? How do you become one of those girls? You're at Sarah Lawrence, which is arguably one of the most progressive schools in the country. You've got all of this freedom as like a college sophomore or junior. You've got all this privilege. How do you end up in a patriarchal sex cult? Like, how do you get to a place where you've agreed to be debased and taken advantage of? And really, these are just questions that we all ask about cult members in general, So I was also really interested in following the NXIVM cult news that has been all over the news, like stories about that cult. And so I was just really interested in the psychology of how a person could get there. And so essentially the premise of this book is that a woman hears in the middle of her day, she finds out from her favorite podcast, no less, that her college best friend has been found dead at their old college campus. And she's died in a way that mimics the same way another one of their friends died their senior year of college. So you've got these deaths that mirror each other. And so the police are potentially going to be ruling this death a suicide, but she immediately is terrified and suspicious and wonders if all of the demons that she thought that she and her friends laid to rest back in college, if they're actually still alive, still out there, maybe more active than ever. And so instead of hiding for the first time in years, she decides to fly back to her old, college town and investigate her friend's death herself, because she knows that there are secrets that only she has access to. And so, of course, that plunges her into this really wild underground world. And so, yeah, it was very, I won't give away any more spoilers than that, but it was a very fun and intense book to write.
Sounds so fascinating. I am so ready to read that one. I forgot that you were writing that one. I'm so ready. You'll have to come back on the show.
Yes, please. I'd love that.
And you're also welcome on. We can talk about rom-coms next time as well.
Let's talk about rom-coms. That'd be so fun.
Very, very different discussion than today.
Yes. A little less intense.
Yeah, just a little. But yeah, I'm so ready for that book, and I think that things like cults, I think it's absolutely horrifying, but so fascinating to hear about and like learn about what constitutes a cult fully.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm fascinated by that. No, I was just going to say, like, and I mean, back to the like exploring flawed women who are making questionable choices, like she is yet another one of them. But just thinking about cults, and when you look at the NXIVM cult, you think to yourself, they're framing a lot of debasement of people, of the cult members, as empowerment and as freedom and liberation. And so like, what are the mental gymnastics that a person has to do to believe that, to buy that?
Yeah.
And are there circumstances in which debasement is empowering? Like, I know that's kind of a controversial question potentially, but basically what is it that compels a person and incentivizes them? And so I really just wanted to explore that deeply, because I think cults are experiences that most of us won't ever have. Hopefully,
Yeah, hopefully. Yeah.
but so all of the core essential elements are questions that I think all of us can relate to about, belonging and, compelling people and feeling drawn and wanting to be part of something that's bigger than us. And so just and maybe just not even really like understanding ourselves and looking to other people to explain us to ourselves. And that gives other people so much power. So all of those questions I was just so fascinated about. And I'm actually editing that book right now. So it's like top of mind for me. And I'm like, oh yeah, okay, I'm really into this story.
Oh, that's so cool. I'm very excited to read that one. Well,
Yay.
Once again, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you. Appreciate you having me.
Appreciate you being here. For Read Between the Lines, my name is Molly Southgate.
I'm Ashley Winstead.
Let's end this the way all great stories end. Happily ever after. The end.
Thank you for listening to Read Between the Lines, a book podcast. This episode is hosted by Molly Southgate. It is edited by Rob Southgate and produced by Southgate Media Group. You can get in touch with the show at readbetweenthelines@gmail.com, or you can send us a voicemail at 708-887-9473. That was 708-887-9473. You can also find us on Instagram at Read Between the Lines Podcast. Thank you so much for listening.